Imagine Kyiv, a city that has been living under the wail of air raid sirens for almost 4 years. But today, its main enemy isn't just missiles, it's darkness. A thick, almost tangible darkness swallowing entire districts, street by street, building by building. Russian strikes are methodically tearing apart the power grid, and electricity has become a luxury, rationed out by the hour. The evening city no longer glows with a million lights, it hums. A low, monotonous drone from thousands of gasoline generators dragged out onto sidewalks by enterprising cafe owners, shopkeepers, pharmacists. These islands of warmth and light have become new social hubs, places where people warm their hands, charge their phones, and forget, if only for a few minutes, the freezing apartments waiting for them at home. This is wartime reality. Harsh, unvarnished, where every drop of fuel and every kilowatt of energy weighs as much as gold, and sometimes as much as a human life. This is one Kyiv. From those dark, frozen streets, we jump to the very heart of the city, the government quarter, to an apartment where darkness never comes. It's always warm here, always bright, and the air doesn't smell of generator fumes. What is this place? A palace of some Arab sheikh? A foreign diplomat's safe house? No, this is the home of a man his business partners jokingly, or perhaps not so jokingly, called Carlson. And while the city struggles to survive, our Carlson, who lives on the rooftop of this world, quietly and methodically packs his suitcases. He isn't panicking. Every movement is deliberate, precise. He knows he has a few hours. Just a few hours before detectives from Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, knock politely but firmly on his door. But by then, he'll be long gone. He'll slip through every checkpoint and be sitting on a plane bound for Israel. And all that will remain for the detectives is to stroll through his luxurious apartment, cataloging his possessions. And it is there, in the bathroom, that they'll find the perfect symbol of this entire saga, its distilled essence, its final touch of cynicism and greed. A golden toilet. Not gold-plated, but made entirely from gleaming yellow metal. An absurd, gaudy object that, in the context of a freezing, war-torn country, looks like the most sophisticated mockery imaginable. And this is where the central question of our story is born. How did it come to this? How, in a country where soldiers in trenches pool money for a used pickup truck and volunteers scrape together their last savings for the front, did the closest friend and longtime business partner of President Volodymyr Zelensky turn out to be the mastermind of a criminal scheme? A scheme that siphoned off $100 million from Energoatom, the very state company struggling desperately to keep the nation from plunging into total blackout. This isn't just a story about corruption. There are thousands of those in the post-Soviet world. No, this is something larger. A story about betrayal on a national scale, about a complete break from reality, and about how even in the midst of the most devastating war, there are still people whose only god is money. Of course, a man like Carlson could never pull off something this big on his own. Grand schemes require coordinated teamwork, and his team was, well, perfect for the job. A real club of like-minded individuals, each with a role to play, and each with a colorful nickname straight out of a spy novel. So let's meet our key players. Our main character, Timur Mindish, known as Carlson. And he's no random businessman clinging to state cash flows. He's one of the co-founders of the Kvartal 95 studio, the very project that turned Volodymyr Zelensky from a TV star into a president. Their friendship and business ties go back decades. More than that, it was Mindich who once introduced Zelensky to the powerful oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky, a man who played a significant role in Zelensky's presidential campaign. In other words, Mindich isn't just a friend. He's part of the foundation, someone from the innermost, most trusted circle. Next in our little club is the man nicknamed the Professor. Behind this alias was none other than Ukraine's Minister of Justice, Herman Halushchenko, a person whose official duty is to safeguard the law, yet, according to investigators, served as the group's high-level protection, solving legal problems and using his influence to grease the gears when needed. Another colorful figure, former Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Chernyshov, known within the group as Che Guevara, a nickname so ironic it almost hurts. The fiery revolutionary, the champion of the oppressed, turned into the call sign of an official who, according to Nabu, invested his share of illicit profits into 4 luxury mansions in an elite riverside suburb outside Kyiv. A revolutionary in spirit, a capitalist in practice. And then there were others, less public but no less important, each with their own alias: the Bumblebee, the Rocket, the Sugar Man. Together they formed not just a gang of opportunists, but a polished mechanism, an underground corporation engineered to siphon money out of the state apparatus. They believed their positions, their connections, and their sheer audacity made them untouchable. They were wrong. They simply forgot one thing. There are other people in this country, people without funny nicknames, whose job is to catch people like them. So, our club of the merry and resourceful, as we've been calling them, felt like they were on top of the world. And it wasn't just swagger born of political proximity. Their sense of invincibility rested on a scheme that was almost brilliant in its simplicity and shamelessness. To understand how they managed to industrialize extortion on a national scale, we first need to understand the peculiar beast they were dealing with. That beast was the state-owned company Energoatom. On paper, it's just the operator of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. In reality, especially during wartime, it's the energy heart of the country, its backbone. And because of its strategic importance, the state granted this heart a kind of superpower, near total legal immunity. Imagine a company built like a fortress. You can sue it for unpaid debts. You can even win the lawsuit. But then comes the twist. When you show up to the enforcement office with a court order in hand, the officers will simply shrug. The law is written in such a way that freezing Energoatom's accounts or seizing its assets is nearly impossible. The idea is noble. No random lawsuit should be able to shut down a nuclear plant and plunge the country into darkness. A noble goal, right? But as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And our heroes saw not a protective measure, but the perfect weapon. They realized that if you're shielded from creditors, you can dictate any terms you want. You can simply not pay, and nothing will happen to you. This is the principle on which their scheme was built, a scheme they jokingly, with a streak of dark humor, called the barrier. And it ran like clockwork in 4 simple steps. Step 1. Install your people in key positions inside Energoatom. You need managers who will sign the right papers without asking too many questions and delay the wrong payments without hesitation. This was the key to the fortress gate, and the club, it seems, handled this task flawlessly. Step 2. Artificially create debt. Imagine you're the owner of a private company supplying ultra-durable cables for nuclear power plant safety systems. You win a tender, deliver the goods on time, sign all the acceptance papers. Energoatom owes you millions, but the money never arrives. Not in a week, not in a month, not in 6 months. You send letters, make calls, nothing. Or you get polite excuses about temporary difficulties. Your company is nearing bankruptcy. You can't pay your staff. And then comes step 3, the offer you can't refuse. Suddenly, a friendly stranger calls and invites you for a casual meeting. Over a cup of coffee, he explains the new reality. If you want to receive your own legitimately earned money, all you need to do is speed up the process. Pay a small kickback, 10, maybe 15% of the debt, naturally in cash. And once the right amount reaches the right hands, the bureaucratic machine magically starts running again, and your payment is processed instantly. That's the barrier. You want to pass? You pay. But what happens if you're an honest business owner and refuse to play these games? For that, our heroes had step 4 prepared: threats. And not vague hints. Real, specific threats, the kind investigators at Nabu would later hear on hundreds of hours of recordings. First came the soft pressure. You'll simply end up on the blacklist, one of the voices says on tape. We'll change all the technical requirements and void all your certificates. For a company working in the tightly regulated nuclear sector, that's a death sentence. But if that didn't work, they escalated. On one recording dated May 15th, there's a line that makes your blood run cold, especially in a country at war. Speaking to a stubborn contractor, a man nicknamed Rocket says, "You'll just go bankrupt, that's all, and all your employees will be drafted." Think about that. This is no longer corruption, it's racketeering, laced with the threat of destroying people's lives. Faced with a choice between losing their business or sending their staff to the front lines, most entrepreneurs broke, and they paid. According to investigators, the total turnover of this barrier exceeded $100 million, money that never went toward repairing power units, improving safety, or paying energy workers. Instead, it flowed straight into the pockets of Carlson, the professor, and Che Guevara. The nerve center of the entire operation, its headquarters, was a modest back office rented in central Kyiv. This was where the most candid conversations happened, where deals were coordinated, where bags of cash changed hands. The members of the scheme felt utterly safe there, as if it were their private fortress. What they didn't know was that this fortress had already become a trap, wired top to bottom with microphones planted by anti-corruption agents. But the most intriguing detail wasn't the surveillance, it was who formally owned the office. It was tied to the family of Andriy Derkash, a former Ukrainian MP who fled to Russia after the full-scale invasion and somehow built a dazzling new career there as a senator. And when detectives raided this den, they found more than documents and stacks of cash. They found souvenirs bearing the insignia of Russia's Federal Protective Service, the FSO. What does that mean? Mere coincidence? A bizarre choice of corporate gifts? Or a sinister hint that the threads of this corruption scheme stretched far beyond Ukraine, all the way into the capital of the enemy state? And that money stolen from Ukraine's energy sector might have ended up not only as golden toilets in Kyiv, but also in the pockets of those giving orders to destroy that energy sector. This question remains unanswered. To truly understand how a golden toilet could appear in the apartment of the president's friend during wartime, we need to step back from the scheme itself and look much deeper, into the medical history, so to speak. Because Operation Midas wasn't a sudden virus. It was a symptom of a long-standing chronic illness that has plagued the Ukrainian state for decades. An illness called kleptocracy, the rule of thieves. And to understand the patient, we must go back to its birth. Back to 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed. When the old system fell, its rules fell with it. In the vacuum of power that followed, like in a petri dish, new life forms began multiplying at breakneck speed. Crime bosses, former Red directors, enterprising party officials. Yesterday's members of the Soviet ruling elite quickly found common ground with leaders of organized crime. They realized that together they were unstoppable. One side knew how to run the state, the other knew how to bypass it. Their alliance created a monster. These were the wild 90s, the era of primitive capital accumulation, when fortunes weren't built on innovation, but on carving up the Soviet inheritance. One of the first people to demonstrate how this could be done on a truly national scale was Ukraine's Prime Minister Pavlo Lazarenko. By various estimates, while holding the highest office in government, he managed to siphon between $100 and $200 million out of the country. He became a kind of patient zero, living proof that you could steal not just a lot, but an absurd amount, and do it straight from the Prime Minister's office. If the 90s were the era of wild, chaotic banditry, the 2000s became the era of systematization. Corruption stopped being a collection of isolated crimes and turned into a finely tuned method of governing the state. In leaked diplomatic cables, American diplomats bluntly described Ukraine under Presidents Kuchma and Yushchenko as a kleptocracy, a state run by thieves for the benefit of thieves. It was in this period that the class of oligarchs was born and solidified, a narrow group of people who acquired control over the most profitable sectors of the economy for next to nothing: metallurgy, chemicals, energy. Their power rested not on free competition, but on proximity to the president and on the control of political parties, courts, and security agencies. The apex of this system was Viktor Yanukovych, a man who came out of the criminal underworld of Donbass. He didn't just participate in corrupt schemes, he was the system. Under him, corruption reached industrial proportions, saturating every sphere of life, from basic local paperwork to multi-billion-dollar state contracts. For many Ukrainians at the time, corruption became something like bad weather, unpleasant but inevitable. Surveys from those years revealed a startling fact. Nearly 40% of citizens didn't consider bribery shameful, but viewed it as a part of social tradition. A cynical philosophy took root. The state will cheat you anyway, so why not cheat it first? Stealing from the state wasn't seen as real theft, more like reclaiming a bit of what was being taken from you every day. And in this atmosphere of total cynicism and exhaustion, something finally snapped in late 2013. The last straw was Yanukovych's refusal to sign the association agreement with the European Union. But the real reason hundreds of thousands poured into Kiev's Maidan was not geopolitics. It was overwhelming, degrading injustice. People rose up against the golden loaf in Yanukovych's residence, against his private zoo, against the prosecutor's sons, who ran people over at crosswalks without consequence. The Revolution of Dignity in 2014 was, at its core, the first large-scale anti-corruption revolution in Ukraine's history. It was an uprising against the very idea that theft could be a social tradition. It was the nation's immune system reacting violently, realizing that the disease had advanced too far and had become life-threatening. Yanukovych's escape and the change of government gave the country hope. But as it turned out, winning a revolution is not the same as defeating corruption. The illness was too deeply rooted, woven into the bone marrow of the system. The old elites didn't disappear. They simply repainted themselves and adapted. The old habits and schemes kept running. Yes, important reforms were launched, new police forces, the transparent Prozoro e-procurement system. But progress was painfully slow. And in this fertile soil, enriched by decades of impunity, the seeds of a new scheme sprouted. Carlson and his crew were products of the old era. They thought in its categories. They genuinely believed that proximity to the new president gave them the same immunity Yanukovych's entourage once enjoyed. They failed to grasp the essential truth. Maidan changed the country forever. It didn't eradicate corruption, but it created something Ukraine had never possessed at this scale: an active civil society and, most importantly, real, independent institutions built to fight corruption. And it was one of those institutions they were about to collide with. So the club, led by Carlson, operated by the old rulebook, convinced that post-Maidan Ukraine had changed only the portraits in government offices, not the rules of the game themselves. They made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the most important child of the Revolution of Dignity. And that child wasn't new politicians or loud slogans. It was a whole system built from scratch, modeled on Western standards, created in defiance of the old elites. A system designed for one purpose only: to hunt big fish. Its name was NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, and its indispensable partner SAP, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. To understand how unique this institution is, imagine a surgeon operating inside a patient's body but not controlled by the patient's brain. NABU is not a regular police force or security service tied into the executive branch and dependent on the president or the government. It is an independent body. Its director is chosen by a special commission that includes international experts, and removing him is almost impossible. NABU detectives have sweeping powers: wiretaps, surveillance, undercover operations, and their specialty is precisely this kind of target: ministers, MPs, judges, CEOs of state companies. The people who used to be untouchable. These were the hunters who took aim at our club. 15 months of meticulous work. 1,000 hours of secretly recorded conversations in that covert office. 70 searches across the country. This wasn't just a police operation. It was a shadow war. And in that war, the hunters won. But here the story takes yet another astonishing turn. One that transforms it from a detective narrative into a full-fledged political drama. Just a few months before Operation Midas was exposed, the office of President Zelensky tried to push a bill through Parliament that would have effectively destroyed the independence of NABU and ASAP, placing them under the control of the Prosecutor General, a politically appointed figure. Why do this? Officially, to optimize the law enforcement system. But Ukrainian society, burned for decades by corruption, saw the real intention instantly: an attempt to seize control of the only independent tool capable of reaching the very top. And then something no one expected happened, especially in the middle of a full-scale war. People took to the streets, not in Maidan-sized crowds, but in numbers large enough to send a clear, unmistakable message. There are red lines you do not cross, not even under the pretext of wartime necessity. Under heavy public pressure and concerns voiced by Western partners who had poured millions into building Ukraine's anti-corruption infrastructure, the government was forced to retreat. The bill was withdrawn. The irony was almost Shakespearean. Civil society saved the very sword that, just a few months later, would come down on the heads of the president's closest associates. When the news about Operation Midas exploded into the public sphere, it hit like a political earthquake. The public's fury was immense. It's one thing to hear about corruption in peacetime. It's entirely different to learn that while you're donating your last savings to buy a drone for the army, someone is stealing millions from the energy sector that literally keeps you alive. One particular phrase recorded by detectives struck everyone with its brutality. In one conversation, members of the scheme lamented that part of Energoatom's budget had to be spent on building protective structures against Russian missiles. A shame, they said, because that money could have been stolen too. That line became the symbol of absolute moral collapse. For President Zelensky, this was a moment of truth, a classic zugzwang where any move worsens the position. Protect your friend, and you confirm the worst suspicions, becoming an accomplice in the eyes of the public and the West. Betray him, and you strike at your own image, admitting that your inner circle harbored traitors. He chose the second path. A cascade of statements followed. Ministers were dismissed, personal sanctions were imposed on Mindich, and his Ukrainian citizenship was revoked. But the shadow had already fallen. And then it turned out that Energoatom might be only the tip of the iceberg. Nabu announced that the investigation led into the Ministry of Defense as well, again featuring Mindich's name, this time linked to suspicious contracts for overpriced, low-quality Chinese body armor. The story began to expand, threatening to engulf more and more high-ranking officials. And this brings us to the central, paradoxical conclusion of this entire ugly, sordid affair. This scandal, despite its destructive potential, is actually a story of hope, a proof that Ukraine, despite the war and its long-standing ailments, is moving in the right direction. Let's imagine, just for a moment, a similar situation in neighboring Russia. An investigation targeting the president's closest friends, wiretaps in their office, accusations of embezzlement. What would happen next? The answer is obvious. Not the president's friends, but the detectives who dared investigate them would be arrested. In Ukraine, we see the opposite. Ministers lose their positions. The president's friend flees the country and is placed on an international wanted list. This is the fundamental difference between autocracy and a functioning, albeit imperfect, democracy. Over more than 30 years of independence, through several revolutions and constant political turnover, Ukrainians have developed a strong allergy to the very idea of an irremovable leader, a czar above the law. For them, the president is a hired manager, entrusted with running the country temporarily. And even the extraordinary powers granted to him during the war do not give him the right to cover for the theft committed by his friends. Because Ukrainians know from bitter experience, corruption during war isn't just stolen money, it's shells not purchased, lives not saved, cities lost. And today, Ukraine fights on two fronts. The first, visible to the whole world, in the east and south, against an external aggressor. But there is a second front, just as important, the internal one, against its own demons, against the kleptocracy that has eaten away at the country for decades. Victory in this quiet, invisible war is not just a matter of justice. It is a matter of national survival. And Operation Midas showed that even in the darkest times, the nation's immune system still has the strength to fight back.